The rain on the day of my husband's funeral felt appropriate, a slow gray drizzle that mirrored the numbness seeping into my bones. It wasn't the sharp, clean pain of grief you read about in novels. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket of silence, the kind that settles in when the world as you know it has ended, but the formalities demand you keep playing your part. I stood at the entrance of the chapel, wrapped in the charcoal gray wool coat he always said made me look distinguished, greeting a procession of somber faces with a practiced, placid smile. Quick pause. Before we continue, tell us where in the world are you watching from? If you're enjoying these stories, make sure to hit subscribe, because tomorrow's episode is absolutely mind-blowing. My fingers, clutching a damp handkerchief in the pocket, were stiff with cold, but I held my posture straight. Robert valued appearances above all else. Even in death, especially in death, I was determined to give him a dignified, orderly farewell. It was the last performance of The Good Wife, and I was determined to get it right. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of lilies and old wood. The low murmur of condolences washed over me. He was a good man. We'll miss him. Such a sudden loss. I nodded, a mechanical doll repeating pre-programmed responses. Thank you for coming. Yes, it was so sudden. My eyes scanned the room, taking in the sea of black and gray, and then they landed on her, Linda Mallister, seated in the front row as if she had a right to be there. She was a vision of curated grief, in a fitted, deep emerald green dress, her makeup flawless, not a hair out of place. A single, delicate tear traced a path down her cheek, and she dabbed it away with a lace-trimmed handkerchief. A masterpiece of sorrow. I felt a hot, sharp twist in my gut, a feeling so alien and violent amidst the numbness that I almost gasped. I looked away, focusing on the podium where our son, Daniel, was about to speak. Daniel. Our only child. At 33, he was the picture of his father in his younger years, tall, composed, with that same air of quiet authority. He looked so handsome and so terribly sad in his sharp, dark suit. His voice, when he began his eulogy, was steady, a low baritone that filled the quiet chapel. He spoke of Robert's work ethic, his intelligence, his love for classical music. He was painting a portrait of a man I recognized, the public-facing Robert, the one he presented to the world. I clutched my handbag in my lap, my knuckles turning white beneath my skin. I was waiting. This was the moment, I thought. After the recitation of his father's virtues, he would turn to me. He would say, and to my mother, who stood by his side for 40 years, who built a home for us, who was his unwavering support system. I could almost hear the words forming in the air. A long-awaited acknowledgement of my existence, of the 4 decades of companionship, of the countless nights spent waiting up, of the quiet sacrifices that form the invisible scaffolding of a family. He paused, and his eyes grew misty. My breath caught in my throat. This was it. There's someone I want to give a special thank you to, Daniel said, his voice dipping, becoming softer, more personal. A hush fell over the room. I leaned forward infinitesimally, a flower straining toward the sundae, someone who supported my father through the toughest time of his life. My heart hammered against my ribs. Yes, Daniel. Tell them I was there, Miss Linda Mallister. The silence in the chapel didn't break. It shattered, exploding in my ears with the force of a detonation. The sound was so loud it was deafening, a roaring vacuum that swallowed all other noise. I saw, as if from a great distance, Linda rise from her seat in the front row. She gave a modest, sorrowful nod, her hand fluttering to her chest, as if overwhelmed by the gratitude. The people around her turned, their faces a mixture of curiosity and surprise. Whispers slithered through the aisles like snakes. Who is she? Robert's assistant, I think. Sitting so close, like she's family. And my son. My beautiful, beloved son had just thanked that woman at his father's funeral. The chair beneath me felt like it had disintegrated. I was falling, plummeting through space, while my body remained perfectly still, a statue of composure. The world began to vibrate at a faint, dissonant frequency. I saw people coming towards me, their mouths moving, their hands extended. I shook them automatically, my smile frozen in place. I was a ghost in my own life, transparent, unseen. The real wife, the mother, had been erased, and in my place was this stranger, this woman in the perfect green dress, receiving the tribute meant for me. I had planned to hold on, to see the service through to the end, to lay Robert to rest with the grace he would have demanded. But then, as the crowd began to disperse, I saw Daniel walk over to Linda. He leaned in, and I saw his lips move. I was too far to hear, but I could read the shape of the words on his face, in the intimate curve of his body towards her. "You're the one who's truly family." The teacup I was holding, a delicate china thing I'd brought from home for a semblance of comfort, slipped from my fingers. It hit the carpeted floor with a dull, thudding sound, the tea spreading in a dark, ugly stain. No one seemed to notice. In that moment, the final veil lifted. This funeral wasn't for Robert. It was an unveiling. It was for the hidden world he had built with this woman, a world where I was not just an outsider, but a stranger, a discarded observer who had accidentally wandered onto the wrong stage. The drive home was a blur of gray streets and weeping windows. The house, our house for 30 years, was silent and cavernous when I stepped inside. The familiar scent of lemon polish and old books did nothing to comfort me. It felt like a museum, a carefully preserved exhibit of a life that had been a lie. I shrugged off the charcoal gray coat, the one he loved, and as I hung it in the closet, I saw that the satin lining at the collar was wrinkled, twisted. It looked tired and cheap, as if the last vestige of my marriage's dignity had been accidentally, carelessly, snapped. I walked into the dining room and sat at the head of the table, my usual seat, staring at Robert's empty chair opposite me. I hadn't moved it. For decades he had held court from that spot, his hand resting on the carved oak armrest, waiting for me to bring him his soup, to listen to his stories about the board meeting, to nod and agree. Now, the chair was just an object. The wood of the armrest was cold and smooth under my fingertips. There was no lingering warmth, no imprint of his presence. It was just a chair. I opened the refrigerator, more out of habit than hunger. There, lined up neatly on the top shelf, were 3 bottles of his favorite German beer. I never liked it, it was too bitter, too heavy. But he'd buy a 6-pack every week, a small, consistent ritual of his own preference in a household I had curated for his comfort. I took one out, the glass cold and beaded with condensation. I realized, with a clarity that was as brutal as it was simple, that habit is the cruelest prison. I had been living in a prison of my own making, built with the bricks of routine, sacrifice, and a blind, foolish trust. Sleep was impossible. The silence of the house was a living thing, pressing in on me. I went upstairs to the study, a room that had always been more his than mine, and pulled out an old photo album from the bottom shelf. The leather cover was dusty, the pages brittle with age. There we were, frozen in faded color. We were so young. Robert had a full head of dark hair and a light in his eyes that I hadn't seen in years. I was smiling, a real, easy smile, my arm linked through his. I even found an old employee ID card tucked between the pages. Margaret Maggie Smith, financial consultant. The photo showed a woman with short, smart hair, a direct gaze, and a self-assured tilt to her chin. I remembered her. She was the one who always sat second from the right at the board meetings, the one who wasn't afraid to challenge a projection or question a budget line. Then Robert had said those fateful words, "You should quit, Maggie. Let me take care of everything. Focus on Daniel, on the house. I'll take care of you." And I, like a fool, had believed him. I had mistaken control for care. I had handed over my financial independence, my professional identity, and packed away that self-assured woman in a cardboard box, believing I was trading up for the security of being a wife and mother. I closed the album with a soft thud. The kitchen clock ticked in the silence, each second a hammer blow against the quiet. I poured myself a glass of water and stood at the sink, looking out into the dark, rain-soaked garden. I realized then that all the pride, all the patience I had poured into keeping our marriage intact, into maintaining that neat, orderly facade, had been buried the moment Robert died. What I was mourning wasn't just the loss of a husband. I was mourning the death of the story I had told myself for 40 years. And I had no idea that the betrayal, the one I had just glimpsed at the funeral, was merely the surface. The deepest cut, the one that would truly break me, was still to come. The next morning, in a lawyer's office that smelled of ink and old wood, I was about to learn that the performance was over, and the real battle for my life was about to begin. The morning after the funeral, the world had not righted itself. The sun was a pale, indifferent eye in a hard blue sky, its light doing little to warm the chill that had taken root deep in my bones. The house was still a museum of lies, every object the sofa we'd picked out together, the landscape painting he'd professed to love, the rug from our trip to Morocco now seemed to hold a sneer, a silent accusation of my blindness. I moved through the rooms like a sleepwalker, the echo of Daniel's voice thanking Linda a constant, low hum in the background of my thoughts. "You're the one who's truly family." I dressed with a numb mechanical precision, a simple black dress, stockings, low heels, armor for the day ahead. I wasn't sure what I was arming myself against, only that I needed protection. The meeting with the lawyer, old Mr. Sterling, was at 10. Robert had used the same firm for decades. They handled his corporate affairs, and I'd assumed our personal estate. I had assumed so many things. The drive to the law office was a study in surreal normality. Children waited for school buses, their laughter like shards of glass. Commuters sipped coffee at red lights, their faces etched with the mundane concerns of a Tuesday morning. My own concern felt planetary in scale, a cataclysm that should have cracked the pavement, yet the world was stubbornly, cruelly continuing on. I parked the car, my hands gripping the steering wheel for a long moment before I could muster the will to let go. The building was an old brownstone, respectable and imposing, the kind of place Robert favored. It spoke of tradition, of stability, of things built to last. The irony was a bitter taste in my mouth. The air inside was exactly as I'd known it would be. A faint, dusty scent of ink and old wood, the kind of smell that clung to legal pads and leather-bound books. A faded print of the Constitution hung slightly crooked on the wall, and narrow strips of sunlight cut through the slats of the blinds, illuminating motes of dust dancing in the stagnant air. It was a room that held secrets, that traded in the fine print of lives. I gave my name to the receptionist, my voice sounding thin and reedy in the hushed space. I was shown into a conference room. Daniel was already there. He sat at the long, polished mahogany table, ramrod straight, his gaze fixed on the grain of the wood. He didn't look up when I entered. He was wearing the same dark suit from the funeral, and he looked so much like his father in that moment, the same set of the sock, jaw, the same aura of detached composure that my heart gave a painful, complicated lurch. Was it grief? Or was it the first flicker of a new, colder emotion? Resentment. "Daniel," I said, my voice barely a whisper. He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod, still not meeting my eyes. "Mother." We sat in a silence that was thicker and more hostile than the one in my empty house. This was a shared silence, and it was filled with everything we were not saying. I wanted to shake him, to demand an explanation for his betrayal at the funeral, to ask how he could sit there, a party to this, this whatever was about to happen. But the words were stuck, a hard, painful lump in my throat. The door opened and Mr. Sterling entered, followed by a younger associate carrying a file box. Mr. Sterling was a man in his late 50s, with a slow, heavy voice that seemed weighed down by the gravity of his profession. Every syllable was deliberate, drawn out, as if to underscore the unchangeable finality of the words he was about to speak. "Margaret Daniel," he said, settling into the chair at the head of the table. He didn't offer condolences. This was business. "We are here today to read the last will and testament of Robert Desmond Smith, dated and executed 3 years ago. 3 years ago. I did the math quickly. That was the year I'd had my knee surgery. The year Robert had told me the firm was going through a restructuring, that he was under immense pressure. The year he'd started coming home later. His excuses thin and perfunctory. I had attributed his distance to stress. I had made him special meals, left him alone to decompress, worried about his blood pressure. All the while, he was here, in this very office, signing me out of his life. Mr. Sterling put on a pair of half-moon glasses and began to read. The language was dense, legalistic, a river of whereases and herebys. I listened, my hands clasped tightly in my lap, waiting for the familiar cadence of a standard will. The spouse inherits the estate, the son receives a trust, the sentimental items are dispersed. It was the script I knew, the one I had taken for granted as the natural order of things. He cleared his throat. Article 4. Bequests. Pursuant to the wishes of the testator, the majority of his assets, including the primary residence located at 2147 Willow Lane, Summerall. I held my breath. Our house. The vacation property located in Nantucket. Our summer sanctuary. And the remaining balances of his personal investment and savings accounts shall be inherited in their entirety by Miss Linda Mallister. The words didn't slice, they bludgeoned. They were a physical blow to my solar plexus, driving the air from my lungs. It wasn't just stunned silence that filled me. It was a complete systemic shutdown. My vision tunneled, the edges turning black, and the only thing I could see was Daniel's profile. He didn't flinch. He didn't turn to me with shock or outrage. His fingers, perfectly interlocked on the table, didn't so much as twitch. He simply continued to stare straight ahead, his expression one of somber acceptance. He knew. The realization was a second, more profound betrayal, ice water in my veins. He had known. He had sat in this room, or perhaps in a similar one, and he had known that his father was disinheriting his mother, and he had said nothing. He had stood at that podium and thanked the woman who was now the legal heir to my home, my memories, my financial security. I felt like I'd been pushed off the main stage of my own life. For 40 years, I had believed I was the lead actress, the keeper of the story. Now, I was standing in the wings, in a dead spotlight, the script torn to pieces. I wasn't sure I had ever truly played the part I thought was mine. Maybe I had just been an understudy, a stand-in, while the real performance happened somewhere else, with a different cast. "Daniel," I whispered, the sound raw and torn from my throat. He finally turned his head. His eyes were calm, unnervingly serene. "You knew," I said, my voice trembling with the effort to keep it low. "Didn't you?" He looked at me with a pity that was far worse than anger. Dad had his reasons. His reasons? The words were choked, barely audible. What did 40 years of marriage mean to him? What did I mean? Daniel was silent for a long moment, as if carefully choosing his words from a prepared statement. "He worked hard his whole life," he said, his tone flat. "Linda was there for him. She understood him." He lowered his voice, almost apologetically, and delivered the final, killing blow. "You didn't. You didn't." 2 words, they erased 4 decades. They invalidated every sacrificed ambition, every quiet night of worry, every birthday planned, every illness nursed, every compromise made to keep the peace, to build a life. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time. So, if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. They painted me as the outsider in my own marriage. The one who didn't understand. I stood up. The room tilted slightly, but I held onto the back of my chair, my knuckles white. I couldn't look at Mr. Sterling's professionally neutral face. I couldn't look at the associate's downcast eyes. And I could no longer bear the sight of my son, this stranger who shared my DNA. I walked out of the conference room, down the hall, and out into the blinding, indifferent sunlight. I didn't wait for Daniel. I didn't say another word. The drive home was a blank. I have no memory of the streets, the traffic lights, the other cars. My mind was a roaring static, a white noise of devastation. You didn't. You didn't. You didn't. I pulled into the driveway and sat there for what felt like an eternity, the engine ticking as it cooled. The weight of my handbag on my arm felt like a leaden weight. This house, 2147 Willow Lane. The garden I had planted, the porch swing I'd spent countless summer evenings on, the window. To the kitchen where I'd stood and watched for Robert's car, for Daniel's return from school. It wasn't mine anymore. It was Linda Mallister's, a trophy of her victory. I went inside, the familiar creak of the floorboard in the foyer, now sounding like a mockery. I walked straight upstairs to our bedroom, his bedroom. I opened the closet. His shirts, his ties, his wool vests were still perfectly arranged, a soldier's lineup of impeccable taste. I breathed in the familiar scent, his cologne, the faint, clean smell of dry cleaning chemicals, the underlying note of him. It was the scent of refined decorum, of a life meticulously managed. But what lies were woven into those very fibers? What clandestine meetings had these shirts witnessed? What whispered promises had been made while he wore this tie? When did he decide I was no longer family? Was it a specific moment? A specific argument? Was it the year I forgot to buy his favorite wine for our anniversary because I was so distracted with planning Daniel's graduation party? Or was it long before that? Was it the day I quit my job as his financial consultant, handing over the reins of my own life, and just became the housewife, the one who didn't understand the pressures of his world? A cold, hard clarity was beginning to cut through the numbness. This wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was a financial annihilation. Robert hadn't just left me for another woman, he had left me destitute. He had taken the security he had always promised me, the security for which I had traded my career, my independence, my very self, and he had handed it to his mistress. The sheer, calculated cruelty of it took my breath away. I started pulling open drawers, not with hysterical frenzy, but with a grim, single-minded purpose. I was looking for proof. Proof that I wasn't crazy. Proof that the life I remembered had existed. Proof of the man I thought I'd married. Old ledgers from when I still managed our finances. Photos from before the light left his eyes. Receipts from trips we'd taken together. A stack of his old business cards. I was an archaeologist of my own ruin, sifting through the strata of a dead civilization. And then, in the kitchen drawer, tucked behind a stack of takeout menus and a broken meat thermometer, I found it. A simple manila folder. Inside were letters, a few receipts, and some clipped-together notes in Robert's handwriting. My heart hammered against my ribs. I pulled out the top sheet. It was a letter from the Nantucket Property Management Company. The date was 6 years ago. But it wasn't addressed to Robert. The recipient was Miss Linda Mallister. It concerned the annual maintenance schedule and landscaping for the property. I had been to that house by the sea countless times. I had chosen the nautical-themed curtains for the guest room. I had stocked the kitchen with the specific brand of coffee he liked. I had spent lonely weeks there while he was tied up with business in the city, staring out at the ocean, wondering why our holidays felt so empty. I had thought I was a co-owner, the lady of the house. The letter in my shaking hand told a different story. I was just a guest, a temporary occupant. The property, in his mind and now in the eyes of the law, had always been hers. The illusion wasn't just shattered, it had been pulverized. The foundation of my entire adult life was not just cracked, it was sand running through my fingers. I sank into a kitchen chair, the cold, hard evidence pressed against my chest. The fight I had sensed brewing last night was no longer an abstract notion. It had a name. It had a face, and I was just beginning to understand the battlefield. The letter from the Nantucket Property Management Company felt like a live wire in my hands, humming with a treacherous energy. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time, just staring at Linda Mallister's name typed so neatly, so officially, on the page. This wasn't a whispered rumor or a gut feeling. This was a fossil, hard evidence of a life that had been thriving in the shadow of my own. The vacation home hadn't just been a place he shared with her. In his mind, it had been hers. He had been curating a life for her, building her a portfolio of comfort and security with the same deliberate focus he'd once applied to our future. I felt like a paleontologist who had just unearthed the first bone of a monstrous, unknown creature, and I knew with a chilling certainty that the skeleton was vast, and it was buried all around me. I couldn't stay in the house with its whispering ghosts and its damning paper trail. I needed an outside voice, a reality check from a world that existed beyond the four walls Robert had so carefully constructed around his deception. I thought of Giselle, our neighbor from across the street. She had been there for 30 years, a constant presence with her prize-winning roses and a memory as sharp as the thorns on their stems. She was a widow, too. Her husband, Arthur, had passed a decade ago. We had shared cups of tea and complaints about property taxes, and she had always been fond of Robert, calling him a man of real substance. I needed to know if that substance had been visible to her from a different angle. I crossed the street, the afternoon sun warm on my back, a stark contrast to the cold knot in my stomach. Giselle was in her front garden, kneeling on a padded cushion, deadheading roses with a pair of sharp, shiny secateurs. She looked up, her face softening into a smile of sympathy when she saw me. "Maggie, dear, how are you holding up?" she asked, pushing herself to her feet and brushing soil from her knees. "One day at a time, Giselle," I said, the practiced response coming automatically. "Do you have a moment for some tea?" Of course, anything for you." She led me through her vibrant, fragrant garden and into her sunroom, a space filled with wicker, furniture and thriving potted plants. The air was warm and moist. It felt alive, so different from the sterile silence of my own home. She busied herself with the kettle and teacups, and we made the usual awkward small talk about the funeral, about the weather. I waited until we were both seated, steaming cups of Earl Grey between us, before I took the plunge. My mouth was dry. "Giselle," I began, my voice carefully neutral. "I wanted to ask you about someone." Linda Mallister. The change in her was instantaneous and telling. Her friendly, open face stiffened. The spoon she was using to stir her tea stilled. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses, her eyes sharp and assessing. "Linda," she repeated, the name hanging in the air between us. She took a slow sip of tea, buying time. "Linda, wasn't she the one Robert would take to those symphony fundraisers? The Thursday night ones at the Grand Hall?" She raised a questioning eyebrow. "You didn't go with them?" The question was a tiny, precise incision. I forced a smile, feeling the skin around my lips crack with the effort. I never really liked those formal events much. The crowds, you know. It was a half-truth. I had disliked them, but I had gone for years because it was expected. Robert had started insisting I stay home about 15 years ago, saying I looked tired, that he knew it was a chore for me, that he could manage the schmoozing on his own. Giselle shifted in her seat, her wicker chair creaking. "Oh, Maggie, I always thought they were an item." She said it so matter-of-factly, as if stating that the sky was blue. "She's been on this street several times. I remember one year quite clearly she helped him put up the Christmas lights. You were laid up with your knee, I believe." I froze. The teacup felt dangerously slippery in my hand. That Christmas, I had been stuck upstairs, my knee swollen and painful after a fall. Robert had spent a whole Saturday, outside, stringing lights along the gutters. When I'd asked him how he managed the high ladder on his own, he'd been vague. "Oh, one of the neighborhood boys helped out. Teenager from down the block." I had pictured a lanky kid earning a few bucks. I had never pictured Linda Mallister, holding the base of the ladder, laughing in the crisp winter air, adorning our home with her presence. The detail was so domestic, so intimate, it was more devastating than the news of the symphony dates. The symphonies were his world. But the Christmas lights, that was our world, my world. And she had been invited in. I had to pause, to steady my voice. "Do you remember when they started getting close?" Giselle stirred her tea again, her gaze drifting to the window, towards my house. She was sifting through her mental archives. "Let me think," she murmured. "I first noticed her car, a little red convertible, hard to miss, parked in your driveway when you were away. That time you went to Atlanta for a month to take care of your sister after her surgery." She looked back at me, her eyes filled with a sudden, dawning pity. "So, at least 10 years ago. Maybe even 15. I remember seeing her coming and going, and I just assumed she was some cousin or something, helping Robert hold down the fort while you were gone. 15 years. The number landed in the center of my soul with the force of a physical blow. 15 years. It wasn't a midlife crisis, it wasn't a late-in-life fling, it was a parallel marriage. A second, secret family unit that had existed for nearly half of my married life. While I was in Atlanta, changing my sister's bandages and trying to keep her spirits up, Robert was here, in my home, with his mistress. While I was budgeting for our retirement, he was likely budgeting for her. While I was believing in the solid, if unromantic, foundation of our life, he was tunneling out the ground beneath my feet. I sat in Giselle's sun-drenched room and felt like a stranger who had walked into the wrong house, the wrong life. All these years, I had managed our finances down to the last penny, proud of my frugality, my foresight. I had chosen his bathrobes, scheduled his physicals, ensured his life ran with the smooth, quiet efficiency of a luxury engine. I had even dipped into the last of my parents' savings, money they had scraped together for a rainy day, to rescue his company during a cash flow crisis in its early years. I had done it without a second thought because we were a team, our fates were intertwined, and all the while, he had been building golden bricks for another woman's future. He had been using the stability I created, the home I maintained, the financial safety net I helped weave, as a launchpad to construct a separate, hidden palace for Linda. He wasn't just betraying me, he was using me, my labor, my love, my family's money, as the fuel for his other life. The sheer, parasitic audacity of it took my breath away. I don't remember finishing my tea. I don't remember what pleasantries I exchanged to extricate myself from Giselle's compassionate, prying gaze. I remember standing on her porch, the vibrant colors of her garden seeming garish and offensive, and looking at my house. It no longer looked like a home. It looked like a crime scene. And I was the detective, finally starting to see the clues that had been there all along. Back inside, the silence was no longer passive. It was accusatory. It pointed fingers. It led me down to the basement, a place I usually avoided, a damp, concrete-floored space filled with the detritus of our lives. Christmas decorations, old furniture, boxes of Daniel's childhood artwork. And in the far corner, behind an old rolled-up carpet, was a cardboard box I didn't recognize. It wasn't labeled. My hands were trembling as I lifted the lid. It was filled with photos, but not the curated, framed ones from upstairs. These were the rejects, the duplicates, the casual snaps. And there, nestled among them, was the truth I had been both seeking and dreading. There was Robert, standing next to Linda at what looked like a company picnic, but it wasn't any company event I had ever attended. His hand rested gently on her arm, not in a professional way, but with a casual, possessive intimacy. He was smiling a radiant, unguarded smile, the kind I hadn't seen directed at me in 20 years. He looked relaxed, younger, happier. My breath hitched. I shuffled through more. There they were at a restaurant, toasting. There was a picture of them on a boat, the wind in their hair. And then, my heart stopped completely. There was a photo of the three of them, Robert, Linda, and Daniel. Daniel looked about 18 or 19, his face still holding the softness of late adolescence. His smile was a little nervous, but it wasn't reluctant. He was standing with them, a part of their unit. My son. In a photograph with his father and his father's mistress, looking for all the world like a family portrait. The air left my lungs in a painful rush. I felt dizzy, the concrete walls of the basement seeming to press in on me. This wasn't just Robert's secret. Daniel was in on it. He had been a part of this hidden world for years. The lunch meetings he'd had with his father, the guy trips they'd taken, had Linda always been there? Had I been funding, through my emotional labor and my homemaking, a family vacation from which I was explicitly excluded? I almost threw the whole box across the room. But then my eyes caught on one particular photo, the one of the three of them. The bottom right corner was odd, a little darker, as if someone had tried to mark over it with a pen. A wild, desperate hope flared in me. A mistake? An accusation? I fumbled in an old toolbox on a shelf and found a soft, pink eraser. Gently, hesitantly, I rubbed at the darkened spot. The ink, old and cheap, gave way easily. Beneath it, written in a loopy, feminine handwriting I recognized from thank you notes Linda had sent me for Christmas gifts she'd received from the Smith family, was a single, devastating sentence. Our little family will be official one day. I could almost hear something break in my chest. It wasn't my heart. That had been pulverized already. It wasn't glass. It was something deeper, more fundamental, something called trust. The trust that the world operates according to a basic set of rules, that vows mean something, that a mother's love is a sacred, unassailable bond. It shattered into a million irreparable pieces, and I knew, with a cold, clear certainty, that it would never be whole again. That night, I didn't bother with dinner. I lit a single candle in the kitchen, its small, defiant flame pushing back against the overwhelming darkness. And for the first time in this house, without Robert, I put on music. Not the classical stuff he loved, but a slow, soft, unhurried jazz record I'd bought for myself years ago and never played, fearing he would find it frivolous. The saxophone wove a lonely, beautiful melody through the empty rooms. As I listened, I started to wonder, maybe I'd lived my whole life to his rhythm. The rhythm of his career, his social obligations, his preferences, his secrets. I had been so busy keeping time to his beat that I had never learned the sound of my own. I looked at the candle flame, dancing to a breeze I couldn't feel. It was a tiny thing, but it was its own light. It didn't need permission to burn. But not anymore, I thought. The resolve hardening inside me, a new core forming around the ruins of the old. From now on, the music, the beat, the dance steps, they would all be mine to choose. The unearthing was complete. The bones of the monster were fully exposed. Now, it was time to decide what to build from the wreckage. The jazz record played on, a soundtrack to my unraveling and my slow, painful reknitting. The image of that inscription, "Our little family will be official one day," was burned onto the back of my eyelids. Every time I blinked, I saw the loopy, confident script, a promise whispered between them over my oblivious head. It was no longer just a betrayal, it was a plan. A patient, long-term strategy for my eventual erasure. Linda hadn't just been waiting in the wings. She had been backstage, measuring the curtains for her new home. I spent the next few days in a state of grim, methodical excavation. The basement box was just the beginning. It was as if a veil had been torn from my eyes, and now I could see the hidden compartments of my own life. I found more photos tucked inside books on Robert's nightstand, a picture of Linda on a beach, signed with "All my love, L." I found receipts for jewelry I never received, for expensive dinners at restaurants he told me he hated. I found a key, small and silver, in an envelope at the back of his sock drawer, with no indication of what lock it might fit. Each discovery was a fresh cut, but the initial, paralyzing shock was gone. In its place was a cold, focused anger. This was no longer about grief. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming the narrative of my own life. I was no longer the victim of a story. I was becoming its archivist, its investigator. The photos were the most damning evidence. They were a timeline of my displacement. I laid them out on the dining room table, the same table where we'd shared thousands of meals, where I'd planned our future. Now, it was a war room. There was Robert and Linda at a company gala, her in a slinky black gown, his arm wrapped firmly around her waist. There they were on a ski slope, their faces flushed with laughter and cold. And there, again and again, was Daniel. Daniel, looking young and slightly awkward, but present. At a baseball game, sandwiched between them. At a backyard barbecue I had never attended, holding a plate of food and smiling at something Linda was saying. The most painful one was a photo from what looked like a birthday dinner. Robert was blowing out candles on a cake, Linda leaning into him, her cheek almost touching his. And Daniel was right beside her, his hand resting on the back of her chair. The intimacy was casual, practiced. This was not a recent development, this was a history. My son had a whole relationship with this woman, a relationship that had roots and rituals, and he had hidden it from me with the same skill his father had. I thought of all the times he'd been evasive about his weekends, all the times he'd mentioned Dad's friend Linda in an offhand way that now seemed meticulously calculated to disarm suspicion. I had been so proud of their close relationship, of the fact that my son admired his father. I never imagined that admiration included an acceptance of his father's mistress, that their bond was partly forged in the crucible of this shared secret. One afternoon, I found myself pulling out my own photo albums, the official ones. I placed them side by side with the pictures from the basement box. The contrast was jarring. In my albums, the photos were stiff, posed. Family portraits from Sears, vacation photos where we stood in front of landmarks, not touching. Robert's smile was always a little tight, his eyes distant. In the hidden photos, he was a different man. His body was loose, his laughter lines were deep and genuine. He looked alive. It was like comparing the official biography with the secret diary. One was for public consumption, a record of a life well lived according to society's rules. The other was the truth, messy, passionate, and cruel. I was the public consumption. Linda was the truth. The photo of the three of them, the one with the inscription, haunted me the most. I took it to a local camera shop, a dusty, old-fashioned place that still developed film. An elderly man with kind eyes and thick glasses looked at it. "Can you tell me anything about this?" I asked, my voice hushed. "The paper, the date, anything?" He held it under a bright light, peering closely. "This is about 15, maybe 20 years old," he said, tapping the border. "See this finish? They don't make this kind of glossy paper anymore. And the color saturation. Yeah, late 90s, early 2000s, I'd say." His words confirmed Giselle's timeline. This wasn't a fleeting affair, this was an institution. Daniel would have been a teenager. His entire formative years were set against this backdrop of duplicity. Had he been conflicted? Had Robert and Linda slowly, insidiously, won him over? Or had he, from a young age, seen me as the obstacle to his father's happiness? The too strong mother who didn't understand. I thought about the year the photo was likely taken. Daniel was 17. It was a difficult year. He'd been struggling in school, clamming up at home. Robert had taken him on a bonding weekend, a fishing trip, he'd said. I'd been so grateful, thinking Robert was finally taking an active role in helping our son through a rough patch. I'd packed their lunches, waved them off, and spent the weekend worrying and hoping they'd connect. Now, a terrifying new image inserted itself into that memory. Were they fishing? Or were they at a cabin somewhere with Linda? Was that the weekend this photo was taken? Was that when the inscription was written? A secret pledge made while I was at home, blind and trusting? The betrayal wasn't just in the act. It was in the theft of my memories, the poisoning of every supposedly happy moment with this new horrific potential. I went back to the box in the basement. There had to be more. I emptied it completely, sifting through every piece of paper. And at the very bottom, beneath a stack of faded postcards from places Robert had supposedly traveled to for work, I found a small, leather-bound datebook. It wasn't from the current year or the year before. It was from 15 years ago. My hands shook as I opened it. It was Robert's handwriting, the sharp, angular script I knew so well. But the entries were a code I was only now learning to crack. Dinner with L. M. 7 p.m. L. M. Nantucket weekend. Meeting Re. L. M. Property. And then, the most chilling entry of all, from a date that corresponded with Daniel's spring break. Family trip to Aspen. Confirm flights for 3. Flights for 3. Robert, Daniel, and Linda. A family trip. While I had stayed home, believing Robert was on a stressful business trip and Daniel was at a science camp. I had been alone in this big, empty house, while my husband and son were on a ski vacation with the other woman. The lie was so vast, so elaborate, it took my breath away. It wasn't a single lie, it was a tapestry of deception, woven through the very fabric of our lives, and I had been sleeping under it for years. That night, I didn't light a candle. I turned on every light in the house, blazing a defiance against the shadows that had lived there for so long. I took all the photos, the datebook, the Nantucket letter, and I spread them out on the living room floor. I was no longer just an archivist, I was a prosecutor assembling her case. The emotional devastation was now a cold, hard fact. The grief had been processed, burned away in the furnace of this new, righteous anger. I looked at the smiling face of my son in those photos, and the pain was still there, a deep, aching wound. But it was no longer a disabling wound, it was a motivator. He had been a child, I told myself. He had been manipulated by his father, charmed by a woman who knew exactly how to insert herself into the vulnerable spaces of a family. But he was a man now. And he had stood in that lawyer's office and chosen their side. The photographic evidence was incontrovertible. It proved the length, the depth, and the brazen nature of the affair. It proved that my son had been a willing participant in the second family, but it didn't prove the one thing I now knew I needed to prove, the financial theft. Robert hadn't just given Linda his heart, he had given her my security. He had likely used our shared assets, the company I helped save, to fund this double life. The photos were the why. The how was still hidden. But I knew where to look next. The evidence wasn't just in dusty boxes in the basement. It was in bank statements, in company ledgers, in the digital trails of the modern world. The woman in the photos, the confident financial consultant I used to be, stirred inside me. She knew how to follow money. She knew how to read a balance sheet and spot a discrepancy. It was time to let her out of the box where Robert had locked her away. I gathered all the photos and documents and placed them carefully in a new, clean box. I labeled it, not with a year or event, but with a single word: evidence. Then I went to the computer, the one I used mostly for recipes and emailing Daniel. I opened a blank document. I titled it, Points to Investigate. My fingers hovered over the keys for a moment, and then I began to type. I listed everything: the properties, the shell company names from the old datebook, the large, unexplained withdrawals from our joint account I'd questioned years ago and been placated about. The rhythm of the keys was a new kind of music, a staccato beat of purpose. The dance had begun, and I was finally leading. The evidence box sat on my desk, a silent, damning monument. The Points to Investigate document grew daily, a sprawling map of my husband's secret life. But a map is useless without a compass, and my internal one was spinning wildly, its needle caught between the poles of a mother's love and a woman's rage. I couldn't move forward, couldn't truly begin the financial excavation, without confronting the human heart of this betrayal. I had to see Daniel. I had to look my son in the eye and demand to know where I stood. In the ruins of his father's world. We agreed to meet at the town cafe, the one with the checkered tablecloths and the smell of fresh pastry that had been a constant since his childhood. It was the place where he'd scraped his knee at 5 and I'd kissed it better over a shared slice of apple pie. Where he'd told me, at 16, that he'd gotten his first car, his eyes shining with a freedom I both envied and feared for him. Where we'd had quiet breakfasts after his father and I had fought, a sanctuary of unspoken understanding. Now it felt like neutral territory, or perhaps a battlefield dressed in homey nostalgia. He was already there when I arrived, seated at a corner table. He wore a trench coat, his demeanor stiff and formal, as if he were preparing for a corporate negotiation, not a conversation with his mother. My heart, that foolish, hopeful organ, gave a painful lurch at the sight of him. He was so handsome, so much his father's son. Before I could even sit down, he placed his phone face down on the table with a definitive click. He always did that. A subtle, infuriating signal that any buzz, any notification could be a valid reason to abandon the conversation, to retreat into the digital world where this messy, emotional reality couldn't touch him. I slid into the seat opposite him, my hands clutching my purse in my lap. The warmth of the cafe felt oppressive. "You look tired," he said, his tone flat, observational. "It's been a long week," I replied, my voice carefully even. A waitress came, and we ordered coffee, a pantomime of normalcy. The moment she left, he went straight for the jugular. No pleasantries, no condolences. "Why did you send Linda a legal notice?" he asked bluntly, his eyes hard. So she'd told him. Of course she had. I had my lawyer send a preliminary letter, questioning the validity of the will and demanding a full accounting of all financial transactions between her and Robert. It was an opening salvo, a warning shot across her bow. I hadn't expected him to be standing on her deck. I took a deep breath, steeling myself, and looked directly into his eyes, those eyes that were so like my own. "Do you think I shouldn't have?" He shrugged, a gesture of supreme indifference that was more hurtful than any anger. "She didn't hurt you. Dad gave her the money. It was his decision. His money. Suing her just makes everyone uncomfortable. Uncomfortable? The word was so trivial, so utterly inadequate, that a disbelieving laugh caught in my throat. Uncomfortable? I repeated, my voice cracking. Daniel, your father deceived me for decades. He built a second life with that woman. I gave up my career for this family. I gave up my friends, my independence. I even sold my mother's emerald ring, the one thing I had left of her, just to pay your college tuition when your father said cash flow was tight. Do you have any idea what that ring meant to me? The memory was a fresh wound. The feel of the cool, heavy gold in my hand, the deep green of the stone that had echoed my mother's eyes. I'd sold it to a jeweler in the city, walking out of the shop feeling like I'd sold a piece of my own soul, but comforted by the thought that it was for my son, for his future. Daniel frowned, exhaling with a visible, weary irritation, as if I were a tedious subordinate bringing up an old, settled budget issue. You always bring it up, he said, his voice low and cold. You always bring things up like I owe you something. The blow was not sharp. It was a dull, heavy weight dropped onto my chest, crushing the air from my lungs. It wasn't an argument. It wasn't even anger. It was a statement of fact from his perspective. A dismissal of a lifetime of sacrifice as a ledger of debts he had no intention of repaying. The distance between us in that moment wasn't just emotional, it was a chasm, cold and definitive, and I was on one side and he was on the other with his father and Linda. Dad told me, he said after a pause, his voice dropping into a confidential tone that was meant to sound wise but only sounded condescending, that the happiest years of his life were with Linda. She understood him, she respected him, she didn't always question and criticize him like you did. Each word was a scalpel, expertly wielded. The happiest years of his life, the years I had spent running his home, raising his son, were just the unhappy prelude. I gritted my teeth, the anger giving me a strength the pain had stolen. I questioned him because he stopped respecting me. I said the words sharp and clear. I criticized him because he was wrong. About business, about people, about how he treated us. Daniel shook his head slowly, a sad, knowing look on his face, as if he were listening to a meaningless sermon from a bygone era. You're too traditional, Mom. You've always believed that making sacrifices is a virtue, that suffering in silence is strength. But Dad didn't need that kind of love. He needed to feel needed. And you were just too strong. Too strong. The words echoed in the silent space between us. I thought of the nights I'd spent hunched over the kitchen table, balancing the checkbook when money was tight, my head throbbing. I remembered the afternoons I'd cooked a full dinner with a fever because Robert had clients coming over and presentation was everything. I saw the years of holding back tears at his cold silences, his subtle put-downs, and pasting on a smile to keep the peace, to maintain the facade of a happy family for Daniel's sake. That was what he meant by too strong. My resilience had been my crime. My ability to endure had made me unlovable. In that moment, I understood with a devastating clarity. This wasn't a sudden revelation for him. He hadn't just arrived at this conclusion in the lawyer's office. He had been thinking this way for a long, long time. He had been watching me, judging me, and finding me wanting. He just hadn't said it out loud until now. I looked at him, this man-child I had carried and nurtured and defended, and all I could see was the ghost of the boy he used to be. The little boy who breathed in ragged, terrifying gasps during asthma attacks while I sat by his bed all night, my hand on his small, heaving chest, counting the seconds between each wheezing breath. The teenager who came home from school, his spirit crushed by bullies, whose dignity I had defended with a ferocity that shocked even me, marching into the principal's office and refusing to leave until something was done. The 17-year-old, whose heart was broken for the first time, who had curled up next to me on the backyard bench, silent and shattered, and stayed there with me until the stars came out and the dew settled on our skin. Did he remember any of that? Or had those memories been edited out, replaced with a narrative of a strong, cold woman who didn't understand his sensitive, elegant father? I reached into my purse, my fingers closing around the worn leather of my wallet. I pulled out an old, faded photograph, its edges soft from handling. It was my secret talisman, a piece of my truth. "That summer," I said, my voice surprisingly steady as I slid the photo across the table towards him. "When you were 2, we went to the beach. Your father backed out at the last minute for work, so it was just the 2 of us. In the photo, he was a toddler wearing bright red swim trunks, standing on wet sand with a trail of tiny, wobbly footprints behind him. His face was turned towards the camera, a mixture of awe and terror. You were terrified of the waves," I continued, my eyes fixed on his face, willing him to remember. "You'd hold onto my neck, so tight, and just scream, 'Mommy, Mommy,' over and over. You didn't know much about the world back then, but you knew where safety was. You knew it was with me." Daniel looked down at the photo. He said nothing. His jaw was tight. "I know you idolize your father," I pressed on, the dam of my restraint breaking. "He was always elegantly turned out. He never raised his voice. He always said the right thing in company. But did you ever think, for one single moment, that maybe I set the foundation for that elegant man to exist? That I was the one who absorbed the shocks and cleaned up the messes so he could present that flawless image to the world, to you?" He looked up then. There were no tears in his eyes, no remorse, just a flicker of something impatience before his gaze hardened again. "Dad did what made him happy," he said, as if reciting a mantra. "Linda made him feel needed. You were just too strong." There it was again, the final verdict. I looked at him for a long moment, at the stranger my son had become. Then, I slowly reached out and took the photograph back. I placed it carefully in my wallet, a treasure reclaimed from a lost world. I stood up. My voice, when I spoke, was calm, but it had a deep, granite firmness he had never heard from me before. "You're right," I said, looking down at him. "I was too strong, and starting today, I'll save that strength for myself." Whatever he said after that, I didn't hear it. I turned and walked out of the cafe, the bell on the door jingling a cheerful farewell. I walked out into the parking lot. It had started to rain again, a fine, misty drizzle. The drops hit my windshield with a slow, relentless rhythm, an orchestra made entirely of silence. I slid into the driver's seat and wrapped my hands around the steering wheel, pausing for a long, suspended moment. I didn't cry. I didn't fall apart. I just sat there, the engine off, the rain painting gray tears on the glass, and realized the final, terrible truth. I had not only lost my husband, I had lost my marriage, I had lost my family. And now, in that cafe, I had officially lost my son. But in that same breath, as I watched the rain distort the world outside, I understood something else, something that felt like the first solid ground I'd stood on in weeks. The waiting was over. The hoping for a different outcome was over. I could no longer wait for someone else, a husband, a son, to tell me who I was or what my life meant. It was time to live for myself. And as I started the car and pulled out into the rain-slick street, I knew, with a certainty that was both terrifying and exhilarating, that the first thing I had to do was burn their narrative to the ground and write my own. The rain followed me home from the cafe, a fitting shroud for the funeral of my relationship with my son. The confrontation had been a failure in every way I had feared, but it had also been a success of a different, colder kind. It had burned away the last vestiges of hope. The bridge was not just damaged, it was ash, and Daniel had been the one to pour the gasoline. There was no going back. There was only going through. The house welcomed me with its now familiar silence, but it felt different this time. It was no longer a tomb for my old life. It was a workshop for my new one. The evidence box on my desk was no longer a collection of painful relics. It was a toolkit. Daniel's words, "You were just too strong," echoed, but they had lost their power to wound. Instead, they had become a catalyst. If my strength was my defining sin in their eyes, then I would wield it like a weapon. I made a pot of strong coffee, the bitter aroma a stimulant for my resolve. I sat down at the computer, the points to investigate document open on the screen. The legal notice had been the first step, a formal challenge. But to win, I needed more than old photos and a date book. I needed contemporary, irrefutable proof. I needed to understand the world Robert and Linda had built online, in the digital sphere where people so often confess their truths while pretending to curate a lie. I had avoided looking at her social media before. It felt beneath me, like snooping. But that woman, the one who worried about what was beneath her, was gone. The woman at the keyboard now was a hunter. I typed her name into the search bar, Linda Mallister. Her profile picture loaded. It was her, on a beach at sunset, the sky, a watercolor of orange and purple. She was smiling softly, not at the camera, but just off to the side, as if sharing a secret with the photographer, Robert, no doubt. The background was edited with a tasteful blur, a technique I recognized as a portrait mode. It was meant to make her the sole focus, but to me, it looked like she was hiding something, as if she didn't want anyone to see what or who was truly behind her. Her bio was a masterpiece of benign narcissism. Consultant in the architecture sector, lover of classical music and community service, grateful for life's tender company. Tender company. The euphemism was so thick it was almost nauseating. I clicked on her photo albums, my heart a steady, determined drum in my chest. The first album was titled Simple Joys. The very name felt like a personal insult. The first image made my breath catch. Robert was seated in a wicker chair on a sun-dappled patio, holding a slice of lemon pie. He was looking at the pie with a boyish, genuine smile of delight. The text below read, "His smile is my favorite reward." The date stamp was from 6 years ago. 6 years, the same year I was bedridden for weeks with a severe flare-up of rheumatoid arthritis. Robert had told me then that work was overwhelming, that he was traveling constantly to secure new investors. He'd seemed so stressed, so burdened. I had felt like a liability, a drain on his energy. I had believed him. I thought his distance was the natural result of the immense pressure he was under, coupled with the burden of a sick wife. But now I knew. He wasn't escaping me. He was living somewhere else, in a sun-dappled world of lemon pie and tender company, while I was in a dark room, grappling with pain and the slow erosion of my body. I scrolled down, an archaeologist of my own humiliation. There was Robert, standing in a living room I didn't recognize, wearing the cashmere sweater I had given him for his birthday. There he was, kneeling in a garden, helping her plant tulip bulbs. The domesticity of it was a special kind of cruelty. He had never shown the slightest interest in gardening with me. I had always been the one on my knees in the dirt, alone. And then a video thumbnail appeared. My cursor hovered over it. It was a Christmas scene, a beautifully decorated tree, twinkling lights. I clicked play. The video was shaky, handheld. Robert stood with his back to the camera, then turned, holding a glass of wine. A Christmas song I didn't recognize played softly in the background. "To us," he said, his voice warm and slightly husky with emotion. He wasn't toasting the camera. He was toasting the person holding it, Linda. Then the camera panned, and my world stopped. Daniel was there. He was younger, probably still in college. His hair was slightly longer, his face still holding the softness of late adolescence, the shy, boyish look he had before he perfected his father's corporate mask. He was standing by the fireplace, holding a glass of eggnog, looking slightly uncomfortable but not unhappy. Linda's voice, off camera, cooed, "Come here, Danny." He shuffled into the frame. She put her arm around his shoulder, pulling him into a side hug. He allowed it. He even gave a small, hesitant smile. "Your dad should be so proud of you," Linda said, her voice dripping with a maternal warmth that felt like a violation. She was speaking to my son, in her home, on their Christmas, while I was likely alone in our house, believing Daniel was at a friend's party. That's when the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place with a sound I could almost hear. Linda was never just Robert's secret. She wasn't just a mistress, she had been positioning herself for years, not just as his partner, but as a surrogate mother. She had been systematically annexing my family, creating a new, improved version where she was the center. The understanding companion to Robert, the cool, approving friend to Daniel. She wasn't just the other woman, she was the planned replacement. And I was the woman she had spent years carefully, patiently, planning to displace. The realization was so vast, so chillingly strategic, that it momentarily eclipsed my anger with a kind of horrified respect. This was not a crime of passion, it was a corporate takeover of a life. A hostile merger where I was the asset to be acquired and then liquidated. I began saving everything. I right-clicked on every photo, every video. I took screenshots of the comments, the dates, the tags. I created a new folder on my desktop, not just named Evidence, but organized. Subfolders: Photos with Robert, Photos with Daniel, Property Clues, Date Verification. I was no longer a grieving wife stumbling in the dark. I was building a case. I was Maggie Smith, the legal wife of Robert, the mother of Daniel, the one who had been edited out of her own life story, and the woman who was about to use their own curated happiness as Exhibit A in the trial to reclaim what was hers. The digital trail was a gold mine. It provided a timeline, a context, a visual representation of the life I had been excluded from. It showed the world they wanted everyone to see, a world of simple joys, tender company, and family Christmases. But to me, it showed the opposite. It showed the depth of the deception, the calculation, the sheer audacity of their theft. They hadn't just stolen my husband and my son. They had stolen my story and rewritten it with me as the villain, the too strong woman who didn't belong in their happy little picture. I worked for hours, until the sky outside my window turned from gray to black, the only light in the room the cool blue glow of the monitor. My back ached and my eyes were dry, but a strange, powerful energy coursed through me. This was my fight now. Not an emotional plea, but a tactical, evidence-based war. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like I was on the offensive. I had found their digital campfire, and I was about to pour water on every last spark. The digital trail was mapped, a constellation of betrayal saved in neatly labeled folders on my desktop. But a map is not a territory. To navigate the legal and financial wilderness that Robert had left behind, I needed a guide. I needed someone who understood the landscape, someone who spoke the language of corporate finance and hidden transactions. I needed an ally. My finger hovered over the contact on my phone. Ruth Lanier. We had been colleagues, equals, at the firm in the days when I was Maggie Smith, financial consultant, not just Robert's wife. We were two of the few women who had clawed their way into the middle management of a testosterone-fueled environment. We'd shared lunches, vented about chauvinistic board members, and celebrated each other's small victories. When I left, lured by Robert's promise of security, we had kept in touch, but the friendship had inevitably faded into the pleasant distance of Christmas cards and the occasional fond memory. She was semi-retired now, I knew, splitting her time between helping her daughter with a new grandchild and taking on the occasional freelance financial forensics case. She was sharp, discreet, and, most importantly, she had never been particularly charmed by Robert's polished facade. I took a deep breath and pressed the call button. She answered on the second ring, her voice exactly as I remembered it, a warm, no-nonsense alto that conveyed both capability and compassion. "Maggie, my goodness," she said, the connection crisp and clear. "I heard about Robert. I've been meaning to call you. I'm so sorry." The genuine concern in her voice was a balm and a catalyst. It almost undid me. "Thank you, Ruth," I said, my own voice steadier than I expected. I didn't stall. There was no time for the slow, polite dance of reacquaintance. "Ruth, I need you to help me find something." There was a beat of silence on the other end, not of hesitation, but of recalibration. The social call had just become a professional one. "Tell me what you suspect," she said, her tone shifting seamlessly into that of a confidential briefing. I paused, gathering the words I had practiced in my head. My voice sounded calm, but it was firm, the voice of the woman I used to be. "I believe Robert used company funds for at least the last decade to buy properties for his mistress, Linda Mallister. And I believe there might be other, unaccounted for transfers." "Large ones?" Ruth went quiet. I could almost hear the gears turning in her brilliant, analytical mind. When she spoke again, her voice was low and serious. "Maggie, you're not just fixing a marriage here. You're looking to expose fraud. Corporate fraud. This is a big deal. It has teeth." "I know," I said, the two words carrying the weight of all I had lost and all I intended to reclaim. "I want the truth. I've spent too long in the dark." She didn't try to talk me out of it. She didn't offer platitudes. Ruth had always been a realist. "Okay," she said, the word a pledge. "Okay. Send me what you have. Every document, every photo, every name and date you've found. Don't leave anything out. We'll need to meet. My house, 2 days. I'll have a preliminary look by then." We agreed on a time, and I hung up, my hand trembling slightly, but not from fear, from anticipation. The isolation of the past weeks shattered. I was no longer alone in this fight. I had just enlisted a general. The next 48 hours were a whirlwind of focused activity. I became a woman on a priest mission. The ghost of my former professional self, reanimating my body. The local library became my second home. I sat at a carrel, the hushed silence a stark contrast to the roaring in my veins, and navigated the public property records database. I looked up Linda's name in Somerville. And there it was, in stark, bureaucratic black and white. One house, a single-family villa, under her name. The purchase date was 5 years ago. My mind raced back. 5 years ago was the tail end of the company's employee housing benefits project, a pet project of Robert's that he had overseen personally. It was supposed to provide subsidized housing for key employees. I had even visited the construction site with him once, joking, "On the next trip, you take me, too. I want to see the finished product." He had dodged, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "You wouldn't like it there, Maggie. It's all concrete and dust, not your scene." Now I knew why. The room, the villa, was not reserved for a client or a valued employee. It was reserved for her. He had used a company initiative, a project I had supported and believed in, as a smokescreen to gift his mistress a home. The betrayal was so layered, so deeply embedded in the fabric of his professional life, it took my breath away. 2 days later, I drove to Ruth's house, the printouts from the property records sitting on the passenger seat like a co-conspirator. Her home was in a quiet, older suburb, a pale gray bungalow with a wide porch. A row of chrysanthemums, past their prime and slightly withering, stood sentinel out front. It was unassuming, a far cry from the curated perfection of my own neighborhood, and it felt instantly, reassuringly real. She greeted me at the door with a tight, knowing hug and a glass of iced lemon tea. Her study was a organized chaos of filing cabinets, bookshelves sagging with financial texts, and a large, high-resolution monitor dominating a sturdy wooden desk. She opened her laptop, the screen glowing in the dim room. "Okay," she said, getting straight to business. I checked some archive payment records from the company's discretionary fund. Robert had wide authority over it. She scrolled through a spreadsheet, her finger pointing to 3 entries, each labeled "Outside Consulting Support." The amounts were significant: $75,000, $120,000, $155,000. The beneficiary company is listed as Quinte Consulting LLC, Ruth continued, her voice dry. But it's a shell, a ghost. No physical office is listed, no other clients that I can find. It's a post office box and a bank account. She zoomed in on one line, the $155,000 payment. This one was paid the same month you were home recovering from your hysterectomy. The air left my lungs. I remembered that month with painful clarity. The physical discomfort, the emotional vulnerability. Robert had been unavoidably detained at work for several nights, dealing with a critical client. I had lain in our bed, feeling frail and alone, believing his absence was a necessary evil for our financial well-being. All the while, he was signing off on a payment of $155,000 to a shell company that undoubtedly funneled straight into Linda's account. He had been funding her life while I was convalescing from a surgery that had, in a way, finalized my role as just his wife, the mother of his child, the keeper of his home. The biological chapter of our partnership was closed, and he was already investing in his exit strategy. Ruth looked at me from over the top of her glasses, her expression a mixture of professional intensity and personal concern. "Maggie," she said softly, "this is just the tip of the iceberg. I'm sure of it. Are you absolutely sure you want to go through with this? Once we start pulling this thread, the whole sweater is going to unravel. Most people in your situation would just prefer to let it go. Take the L and try to move on." I looked at the screen, at the cold, hard numbers that quantified my husband's contempt for me. I thought of the photo of Daniel with them at Christmas. I thought of the inscription in the basement photo. "Our little family will be official one day." I didn't answer her question with words. I simply took my flash drive from my purse and handed it to her. She plugged it in, and I watched as she saved a screenshot of the damning spreadsheet to my file. The action was my answer. Letting go was not an option. Moving on required justice first. On the drive home, I went slow. The autumn sun was low in the sky, hitting my windshield, and the air streaming through the open window smelled of decaying leaves and wood smoke. The radio played an old, melancholic ballad from the 60 seconds. The chorus repeated, soft and insistent, "You only find the truth when you stop pretending." Yes, I thought. A grim smile touching my lips for the first time in weeks. Only when you stop pretending the marriage was solid, that your son is on your side, that your life was what it appeared to be, only then do you begin to see clearly. The pretending was over. The truth was ugly and painful, but it was mine. And with Ruth by my side, I was no longer just seeing it, I was armed with it. The alliance with Ruth had shifted something fundamental inside me. The solitary simmering rage was now a focused, collaborative campaign. I was no longer a ghost haunting the ruins of my life. I was a field agent, gathering intelligence. The paper chase became my obsession, a tangible purpose that gave structure to my days and a target for my pain. Ruth's preliminary findings were the catalyst. The shell company, Quinte Consulting LLC, was the key. It was the financial ghost through which Robert had likely funneled not just the 3 payments she'd found, but potentially many more. My task, while she dug deeper into the company's archaic digital archives, was to follow the physical trail. If money was a river, I needed to find the properties it had irrigated in Linda's world. The local library became my command center. I felt a strange sense of homecoming sitting at those worn wooden carrels, the scent of old paper and quiet industry filling my senses. It was a world of facts, of records, of unassailable data, a welcome antidote to the emotional quagmire I'd been drowning in. I navigated the public access terminals, my fingers flying over the keys with a proficiency I hadn't used in years. I was no longer Maggie, the betrayed wife. I was Maggie, the investigator. I started with the Somervell County Property Appraiser's website. The villa under Linda's name was there, a cold, digital fact, but I needed more. I cross-referenced her name with neighboring counties, with business licenses, with any public record I could access. The search felt like panning for gold in a river of mud, each click a hopeful sift through the sediment of bureaucratic data. And then, I found it. Not another property, but a business registration. A small, high-end interior design studio, LM Curated Spaces, registered to Linda Mallister. The business address was a trendy downtown loft space, but the registered agent was listed as a law firm I didn't recognize. A quick search revealed the firm specialized in setting up and managing corporate shells for private clients. My heart hammered against my ribs. This was the connection. The shell company, Quinte Consulting, paid for by Robert's firm, was likely funding her business. He wasn't just giving her a house and cash, he was bankrolling her professional identity, her independence, with money that was morally, if not yet legally, half mine. He had built her a complete, self-sustaining life, a life that mirrored the one he had convinced me to abandon. I printed everything, the whir and thump of the library printer sounding like a drumbeat of progress. I felt a grim satisfaction, the same kind I used to feel when I'd untangle a complex financial discrepancy at the firm. The puzzle pieces were starting to connect. Meanwhile, Ruth was doing the heavy lifting in the digital depths. 2 days after our meeting, a new email from her arrived in my inbox. The subject line was simple, clinical. 3 suspicious transactions, key preliminary legal feasibility assessment. I was wiping down the kitchen sink when the notification chimed. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, casting clean, sharp stripes across the countertop. I paused, a damp rag in my hand, and had a sudden, vivid memory. This was how my marriage had been maintained. Tidy, silent. Every surface wiped clean of mess, every emotion neatly contained, until the kitchen, the house, my very life, no longer felt like my own. It felt like a stage set I was hired to maintain. I dried my hands and opened the email. A few familiar PDF statements filled the screen, but now they were annotated with Ruth's sharp, precise comments in red text. She had highlighted the company name, Quinte Consulting LLC. She had drawn an arrow to the account number, noting, "Account tied to Linda M. via intermediary bank. Trail is obfuscated but traceable." Then, the transfers themselves. 3 payments, carefully staggered over 5 years. $75,000, $120,000, $155,000. Total, $350,000. Ruth had circled the dates. Note the timing, her annotation read. Each payment is issued just outside the company's official quarterly audit cycle. This is not a coincidence. This is a pattern of deliberate concealment. At the bottom of the email, she had added a separate note, her professional assessment. "Maggie, this sum lacks sufficient justification." The company received no discernible goods or services from Quinte Consulting. Unless invoices for services of equivalent value can be produced, which I highly doubt exist, this is not a business expense. This is a fraudulent gift, a systematic siphoning of company assets for personal benefit. There it was, the proof. Not of the affair I had that in spades, but of the crime. The cold, hard, litigable fact. Robert hadn't just been unfaithful, he had been a thief. He had stolen from his own company, a company I had helped build and save, to enrich the woman he had chosen over me. I felt a knot form in my chest, but it wasn't made of sorrow. It was resolve, hard and dense. This was no longer about saving a marriage or winning back a son. That ship had sailed, burned, and sunk. This was about accountability. This was about ensuring that the elegant, untouchable facade Robert had built would come crashing down, revealing the corrupt foundation beneath. I knew what I had to do. The paper chase was over. The evidence was assembled. It was time to engage the legal cavalry. That afternoon, I didn't hesitate. I looked up firms that specialized in fraud and corporate law. I needed someone who wouldn't be intimidated by Robert's legacy, by Linda's calculated innocence, or by Daniel's opposition. I found one. Robinson and Associates. The lead attorney was a woman, Michelle Robinson. Her bio stated she was in her mid-50s and had a reputation for being tenacious and thorough in complex financial litigation. I picked up the phone, my hand steady. Michelle Robinson, a warm, no-nonsense voice answered. "Miss Robinson," I began, my voice clear and steady, the voice of the woman in the old employee ID photo. "My name is Margaret Smith. I have a whole host of questions. I believe my late husband systematically plundered his company to aid his longtime mistress, and I have documentation to support it." There was a pause on the other end, not of shock, but of focused attention. "I see," Michelle Robinson said. "You need to send me everything you have. Every document, every email, every photo. Don't filter it. Let me be the judge of what's relevant." I hung up and immediately started compiling the digital files. The photos, the scanned letters, the property records, Ruth's annotated financial statements. When I was finished, the folder contained over 50 documents. I then printed everything out, a tangible weight of truth. I arranged it all neatly in a heavy, legal-sized folder, creating a chronological narrative of betrayal and theft. The next morning, I drove it to her downtown law office, a gleaming glass skyscraper that spoke of power and success. As I waited in the sleek, minimalist reception area, I looked out at the Chicago skyline, a view Robert would have loved. I didn't feel small anymore. I felt like I was finally stepping onto the battlefield he had chosen, but I was the one bringing the real weapons. When Michelle Robinson walked in, she had a kind but professional smile. Her haircut was sharp, framing a strong jaw, and she wore a perfectly fitted navy blue suit. She looked like a woman who won cases. She took the folder, her movements efficient. She flipped through it, her eyes scanning the pages, pausing at the financials, at the photos of Daniel. She nodded, a single, decisive dip of her chin. "We will go through this," she said, her voice firm and reassuring. "Thoroughly. I'll be in touch early next week." "Thank you," I said, looking her directly in the eyes. "She betrayed me, and my son helped her. I don't just want to win. I want her to pay back every last cent." Michelle pushed her glasses higher on her nose, a glint of steely resolve in her eyes. "Mrs. Smith," she said, "we will do our best." As I walked out of the building and back into the sunlight, I felt a profound shift. The paper chase was over. The war had just officially begun. And for the first time, I had a general who knew how to fight it. The days following my meeting with Michelle Robinson were a strange limbo, a quiet before the storm I was actively summoning. The house, once a source of pain, became a headquarters. I organized files, made timelines, and waited for the phone to ring with the weight of my future on the other end. The initial meeting had been about presenting the evidence. What followed was the meticulous, unglamorous work of building a fortress around it. Michelle's call came exactly 1 week later, her voice crisp and focused through the receiver. "Maggie, it's Michelle. I've reviewed the materials with my team. It's a compelling case. The financials are the cornerstone. The pattern of payments to the shell company is textbook concealment. The photos and personal documents provide crucial context, establishing the motive and the depth of the relationship. We're ready to proceed. The first step is to file a civil suit against Linda Mallister for unjust enrichment and constructive fraud. We'll also be naming Robert's estate, which effectively means you, as the plaintiff, to reclaim the misappropriated assets." Hearing the legal terms unjust enrichment, constructive fraud was like watching my raw, emotional devastation being translated into a cold, precise language a court could understand. It was validating. My pain had a precedent. My betrayal had a statute. "What do you need from me?" I asked, my voice steady. "Courage, mostly," Michelle replied, a hint of dry humor in her tone. "And your availability. There will be depositions, discovery, a lot of paperwork. It will be invasive. They will try to paint you as a bitter, vengeful widow. Are you prepared for that?" I thought of Linda's perfect, tear-streaked face at the funeral. I thought of Daniel's cold dismissal in the cafe. "They've already taken everything else," I said. "My reputation is the least of it." The legal machinery ground into motion with a series of formal, terrifyingly official letters. The lawsuit was filed. The case, Smith v. Mallister, now had a docket number, a life of its own in the court system. As Michelle predicted, the process was invasive. I spent hours in her conference room, rehearsing my testimony, going over every detail of my marriage, my finances, the moment I found the Nantucket letter. It was emotionally grueling, like performing an autopsy on my own life with a room full of strangers taking notes. And then the storm broke. The case made waves. Robert's former firm, a pillar of the local business community, was entangled. The story was too juicy to ignore. Prominent architect's secret double life. Widow sues mistress for millions. I saw a small blurry photo of myself in the business section of the newspaper, looking pale and startled, caught leaving Michelle's office. I stopped reading the articles after the first one. The commentary was irrelevant. The truth was in the filings. The first and most violent backlash came from Daniel. My phone rang late one evening, his name flashing on the screen. For a wild, hopeful second, I thought he might have seen the evidence, that he might finally understand. I was wrong. "How could you?" His voice was a low, furious snarl. So, unlike his usual controlled tone, it was almost unrecognizable. "You're destroying his memory. Dragging his name through the mud for money. I knew you were cold, but I didn't think you were a monster." The words should have eviscerated me. Instead, they solidified my resolve. He wasn't calling to understand, he was calling to condemn. He was still choosing their narrative. "Daniel, your memory of your father is a fairy tale," I said, my voice eerily calm. I was too drained for his anger. "He wasn't the elegant saint you idolize. He was a con man. He used company money I helped earn, money that was meant for our family's security, to betray me, his wife, and to buy the affection of his mistress. That's the truth. The lawsuit isn't about destroying his memory. It's about exposing the truth he built his life upon. He was my father," he shouted, the sound raw and painful. "And I am your mother." The words erupted from me, not as a scream, but as a declaration of a forgotten fact. "And for the last 15 years, You have been a willing participant in his deception. You stood with them in photos. You spent Christmases with them. You thanked her at his funeral. You have chosen their side at every turn. So don't you dare call me a monster for finally fighting back." There was a stunned silence on the other end. I had never spoken to him like that before. I had always been the placater, the peacemaker. "I have nothing else to say to you," he said, his voice dropping to a deadly quiet. "Don't call me again." The line went dead. I held the phone in my hand, listening to the dial tone, waiting for the familiar, crushing pain to descend. It didn't. In its place was a vast, empty silence. The final thread had been cut. The chasm was now complete and absolute. I had lost my son. The knowledge was a heavy, permanent stone in my gut, but it no longer had the power to paralyze me. It was simply a fact, as cold and hard as the legal documents on my desk. The next few months were a whirlwind of appointments, emails, and legal proceedings, just as Michelle had warned. We entered the discovery phase, where both sides are required to share evidence. Linda's lawyer, a slick, condescending man who seemed to have stepped out of a corporate espionage thriller, produced a stack of invoices. They were from Quinte Consulting, detailing strategic market analysis and client outreach services. They were flimsy, generic, and, as Ruth had predicted, utterly unconvincing. They were the desperate shield of someone caught in the act. Our side was methodical. We had Ruth's brilliant analysis, which picked apart the invoices, showing they didn't align with any known company projects. We had the property records, proving Linda's assets were acquired concurrent with the payments. And we had the photos, the visual, undeniable proof of the personal relationship that gave context to the financial crime. We weren't just claiming fraud. We were showing the why. Through it all, Michelle Robinson was my rock. She was more than a lawyer. She was a strategist and a therapist. She prepared me for every deposition, every tough question, teaching me to strip the emotion from my answers and present the facts. "The judge doesn't need to know how much it hurt," she would say. "The judge needs to know when you found the letter and what it said. Stick to the facts. The facts are on our side." I learned to speak the language of the law. I learned to refer to Robert as the decedent and to our home as the marital asset. It was a defensive mechanism, a way to survive the process without shattering. I was compartmentalizing, locking the weeping widow in a room and letting the calm, determined plaintiff take the wheel. The legal front was no longer a frightening abstraction. It was a daily reality, a grueling marathon, but with every document filed, every lie of Linda's exposed, I felt a piece of my power returning. I was no longer a victim reacting to a betrayal. I was a force, actively dismantling the lie, brick by fraudulent brick. The courtroom was no longer a place I feared, it was the arena where I would finally be heard. The calm, methodical pace of the legal process gave way to a palpable tension, a gathering storm of depositions, motions, and strategic posturing. The lawsuit was no longer a private grief, it was a public spectacle, and the winds of scandal whipped through the lives of everyone involved. I had become a figure of gossip, the vengeful widow, but the notoriety was a price I was willing to pay. Inside, I was steely, focused. The emotional purge with Daniel had left me hollowed out but clean, ready for the fight. The heart of the storm, I knew, would be the deposition of Linda Mallister. It was the first time I would be in the same room with her. Since the funeral, the first time I would see the woman who had spent years plotting my replacement face to face, under oath. The setting was Michelle Robinson's conference room, a space designed to intimidate with its sleek mahogany and unforgiving lighting. Linda arrived with her lawyer, looking every bit the polished professional. She wore a conservative navy suit, her hair pulled back in a severe but elegant chignon. She didn't look at me. She took her seat as if she were the one in charge, her posture perfect, her hands folded neatly on the table. She was playing the part of the unjustly accused businesswoman, a role I was sure she and her lawyer had rehearsed extensively. Michelle began the questioning, her tone deceptively mild. She led Linda through her professional history, her role at Robert's firm, the nature of her consulting work for Quente LLC. Linda's answers were smooth, rehearsed. She spoke of market analysis and client retention strategies with a vapid fluency that was meant to bore us into submission. Then, Michelle shifted. Miss Mallister, can you describe the nature of your personal relationship with the decedent, Robert Smith? Linda's mask didn't slip, but it tightened. Robert was a dear friend and a valued mentor, she said, her voice dripping with saccharine sincerity. A friend, Michelle repeated, making a note. Did this friendship include romantic involvement? I don't see how that's relevant, Linda demurred, glancing at her lawyer. The court will determine relevance, Michelle said coolly. Please answer the question. Linda took a delicate sip of water. Over the years, our relationship deepened beyond a professional friendship. We cared for each other deeply. Michelle let the euphemism hang in the air for a moment before she began placing photographs on the table. One after another. Robert and Linda at the symphony. Robert and Linda on the beach in Nantucket. Robert, Linda, and Daniel at the Christmas gathering. The video still of Robert toasting her. Would you describe these as activities typical of a professional friendship? Michelle asked, her voice still calm. Linda's composure began to show hairline fractures. A slight flush crept up her neck. We shared common interests. And the inscription on this photograph. Michelle slid the basement photo across the table, the one with the erased pen marks now digitally restored. Our little family will be official one day. Did you write that, Miss Mallister? Her lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The words were in the room, a venomous snake coiled on the polished wood. Linda's eyes flickered to me for the first time, a flash of pure, unadulterated hatred before she looked away. She didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence was an admission. The deposition continued, but the battle was won in that moment. Her facade of the innocent business associate had been shattered, revealing the calculating woman beneath. She was forced to admit to the trips, the gifts, the intimacy. She clung to the fiction that the money from Quinte Consulting was payment for legitimate work, but her answers became evasive, contradictory. The storm was breaking, and she was being exposed to its full force. The backlash from this exposure was immediate and vicious, but it came from an unexpected quarter. Robert's former partners at the firm, who had initially been circumspect, now began to distance themselves publicly. The scandal was bad for business. Whispers of internal audits began to circulate. The very legacy Daniel was so desperate to protect was being tarnished not by my lawsuit, but by the facts the lawsuit was revealing. And then Daniel struck back. It wasn't a phone call this time. It was a formal legal motion. He filed a petition to have me removed as the executor of Robert's estate, citing the antagonistic nature of my lawsuit as a conflict of interest. He claimed I was not acting in the estate's best interests by suing it. It was a brilliant, cruel legal maneuver. He was using the very system I was relying on to try and cut me off at the knees. He was siding with Linda not just emotionally, but legally and financially, attempting to strip me of my standing to sue her. When Michelle told me, I felt a new kind of despair, one that had nothing to do with a lost husband and everything to do with a son who had become my adversary in a court of law. He wasn't just defending his father's memory. He was actively fighting to ensure Linda kept the money. He was fighting against me. The hearing for his motion was a small, brutal affair in a sterile courtroom. Seeing Daniel on the other side, sitting beside Linda's lawyer, felt like a scene from a dystopian nightmare. His argument was that my lawsuit was a personal vendetta that was depleting the estate's resources with legal fees. His lawyer painted me as an unstable, bitter woman driven by jealousy. When it was my turn, Michelle stood. She was magnificent. She didn't address the personal attacks. She stuck to the law. "The petitioner seems to misunderstand the purpose of this lawsuit," she said, her voice ringing with clarity. "Mrs. Smith is not depleting the estate. She is attempting to replenish it. The assets we are seeking to recover from Miss Mallister were fraudulently taken from the company, which is a primary asset of the estate. To not pursue this claim would be a gross dereliction of her fiduciary duty. She is, in fact, the only one at this table acting in the estate's best interests." The judge, a weary-looking man with a keen gaze, listened intently. He denied Daniel's motion. He saw it for what it was, a transparent attempt to obstruct the course of justice. As the gavel fell, I looked at my son. He didn't look at me. He stared straight ahead, his face a mask of cold fury. The chasm between us was now codified in a court order. The victory was essential, but it tasted like ash. The cost of this fight was being tallied in a currency far more valuable than money. The storm was gathering, yes, but it was no longer just a legal one. It was a hurricane tearing through the last remnants of my family, and I was standing in the eye, watching the destruction, wondering what, if anything, would be left standing when the winds finally died down. The day of the trial arrived, not with a clap of thunder, but with the sterile hum of fluorescent lights and the scent of lemon-scented polish. The courtroom was a theater of wood and marble, a place where human drama was stripped down to exhibits, objections, and the slow, grinding wheels of justice. I wore a simple, dark blue suit armor I had chosen with Michelle's guidance. "You want to look credible, strong, but not aggressive," she had said. "Let the evidence be the aggressor." I took my seat at the plaintiff's table, my back straight, my hands folded on the cool wood. Michelle sat beside me, a pillar of calm competence. Across the aisle, Linda sat with her lawyer. She was a study in calculated vulnerability, dressed in a soft gray dress, her makeup subtle, her posture slightly bowed. She was playing the part of the bewildered, grieving friend, a role I was sure she had perfected. Daniel was in the gallery, directly behind her. His presence was a physical weight against my back, a constant, painful reminder of the true cost of this day. The judge entered. She was a black woman in her mid-60s, her face a map of intelligence and experience, her eyes sharp and missing nothing. She carried an air of no-nonsense authority that immediately quieted the room. This was Judge Evelyn Watkins, and her reputation for being fair, thorough, and impatient with nonsense preceded her. I felt a flicker of hope. She looked like a woman who had seen enough of life to understand the complexities that lay beneath the surface of a legal filing. The opening statements were a study in contrast. Linda's lawyer painted a picture of a hardworking, loyal employee and friend, a woman who had provided invaluable consulting services and was now being cruelly persecuted by a jealous widow. He spoke of Robert's generosity, his autonomy, his right to dispose of his assets as he saw fit. Then Michelle stood. She didn't raise her voice. She simply laid out the story, our story, with the clarity of a master storyteller. "This case is not about jealousy, Your Honor," she began. "It is about theft. It is about a systematic, decade-long scheme by Robert Smith, aided and abetted by the defendant, to loot his own company. They didn't just betray a marriage. They betrayed fiduciary duty, they betrayed corporate law, and they committed fraud. We are here today to follow the money, and to show that every dollar that ended up in Linda Mallister's pocket was first stolen from the company Robert Smith was sworn to protect." The trial unfolded over days that felt both endless and fleeting. Linda's lawyer put on his case, presenting the flimsy invoices from Quinte Consulting. Under Michelle's cross-examination, they crumbled. "Can you name a single client you secured for the firm through this market analysis?" Michelle asked. "It was more about brand awareness," Linda hedged. "Can you point to a single, specific project this $155,000 payment funded?" The work was ongoing and holistic. Her answers were evasive, her confidence fraying. Michelle was a surgeon, deftly dissecting her testimony until all that was left were the bare, ugly bones of the lie. Then it was our turn. We called Ruth to the stand. She was brilliant. With the aid of charts and timelines displayed on a screen, she walked the judge through the financial forensics. She explained the shell company, the timing of the payments just after audit cycles, the complete lack of deliverables. She made the complex, dry numbers tell a story of deliberate, calculated deception. It was devastatingly effective. And then it was my turn. My name was called. I stood and walked to the witness stand, the eyes of the courtroom upon me. I took the oath, my voice clear and steady. Michelle approached. "Mrs. Smith, can you tell the court about your marriage?" I took a breath. I didn't look at Daniel. I didn't look at Linda. I looked at the judge, a woman who might understand. And I began to speak. I spoke not with the hysterical pain of a betrayed wife, but with the measured sorrow of a historian recounting a fallen civilization. I talked about the 40 years, about the early dreams, the shared struggles, the slow, quiet erosion of respect. I talked about giving up my career, about selling my mother's ring for Daniel's tuition. I described the funeral, the moment my son thanked another woman. I described finding the Nantucket letter, the photos in the basement, the inscription that promised my erasure. I spoke of the financial vigilance, the years of managing the household budget while unknowingly funding my own replacement. I was careful, as Michelle had coached me, to stick to the facts, but the facts themselves were so deeply emotional that they needed no embellishment. I was simply bearing witness to the demolition of my life. When I mentioned the photo of the three of them at Christmas, my voice wavered for the first time. I looked at Judge Watkins. Her expression was unreadable, but she was listening, truly listening. I saw a flicker of something in her eyes, not pity, but a deep, resonant understanding. I think she saw the ghost of 1,000 other women in my place, women who had built lives only to discover the foundation was sand. Michelle then entered the photographs into evidence. One by one, they were displayed. Robert and Linda laughing on a boat. Robert, Linda, and Daniel, a happy triptych. The judge looked at them, her face impassive, but I knew she was seeing the story we were telling, not of a simple affair, but of a parallel life. A second family funded by fraud. Linda's lawyer did his best to break me on. Cross-examination. He tried to paint me as cold, neglectful, a wife who didn't understand her husband, hoping to justify Robert's actions. "Is it true you were often critical of your husband?" he asked. "I was critical when he made mistakes that jeopardized our family's security," I replied. "That is not a character flaw. It is a responsibility. And isn't it true that your son, Daniel, has sided with Miss Mallister in this dispute?" Michelle objected. Relevance. The judge sustained it, but the poison dart had been launched. It didn't matter. The truth was out. It was in the financial records Ruth had so masterfully explained. It was in the photos that depicted a life of intimacy and planning. It was in my testimony, the quiet, devastating account of a 40-year partnership revealed as a sham. When the trial concluded, there was no dramatic closing argument that could top the evidence. The facts spoke for themselves. Judge Watkins listened to the final statements, her hands steepled under her chin. She thanked both sides and announced she would take the case under advisement, with a ruling to come in writing. Walking out of the courtroom, I felt emptied out, scoured clean. I had done it. I had stood in the heart of the storm and told my truth. I had looked my betrayers in the eye and not flinched. The reckoning was complete. The verdict, whatever it was, would now be in the hands of the law. And for the first time, I felt a peace that had nothing to do with winning or losing, and everything to do with having finally, after a lifetime of silence, spoken my piece. The weeks following the trial were a peculiar form of limbo. The frantic energy of preparation and the high-stakes tension of the courtroom had evaporated, leaving behind a profound, echoing silence. The house, which had been my command center, now felt like a waiting room. I had done everything I could. The evidence had been presented, my testimony given. The story of my betrayal was now bound in legal briefs. Sitting on Judge Watkins's desk, awaiting her judgment. The fight was over. All that remained was the verdict. I tried to reclaim a routine. I gardened, pulling weeds with a ferocity that left my muscles aching. I cooked simple meals for one, eating at the kitchen counter instead of the formal dining table. I avoided the news and the business section of the paper. The outside world, with its opinions and gossip, felt irrelevant. This was now a private matter between me, the law, and the ghost of my husband. The victory in court, if it came, would be a hollow one. I had already lost so much that no judge could restore. The marriage was ashes. The trust I had in the fundamental structures of my life, family, partnership, security had been annihilated. And my son, my Daniel, was a stranger who had legally petitioned against me. The chasm between us felt wider and deeper than any courtroom aisle. I had stood before a judge and recounted the story of his betrayal, and he had sat in that same room and heard it. There was no coming back from that. The void he left was a physical ache, a constant, cold presence in the house. One overcast afternoon, the mail arrived. Amidst the bills and catalogs was a thick, cream-colored envelope from the law offices of Robinson and Associates. My heart stuttered, then settled into a heavy, rhythmic thud. This was it. I carried it into the kitchen, placing it on the counter as if it were a live explosive. I made a cup of tea I didn't want, my hands trembling slightly. The silence in the house was deafening. Finally, I slid my thumb under the flap and pulled out the letter. It was from Michelle, but attached was the formal court order. I skimmed her covering note first. Maggie, Judge Watkins ruled in our favor on all counts. It's a complete victory. Call me when you're ready to discuss the details. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. Then, I turned to the order itself. The language was dense, legalistic, but the meaning was crystal clear. Judge Watkins had found Linda Mallister liable for unjust enrichment and constructive fraud. She ordered her to repay the entirety of the funds Robert had funneled to her through Quinte Consulting LLC, a sum totaling $350,000, plus prejudgment interest. Furthermore, she voided the transfers that had purchased the Somerville Villa and the Nantucket property, ruling that they were acquired with fraudulently obtained funds. The properties were to be sold, and the proceeds returned to Robert's estate to me. The total judgment was well over $1 million. I read the words again and again: liable, fraud, repay. We had won. Decisively. A strange numbness settled over me. There was no surge of triumph, no cry of victory. Instead, a quiet, weary relief washed through me, followed immediately by a wave of immense sadness. This document, this piece of paper, was the official, legal confirmation that my husband had been a criminal and a liar. It was the final, absolute end of the story I had told myself for 40 years. The practical consequences unfolded quickly. Linda was ruined. The judgment was public record. The architecture firm, LM Curated Spaces, folded almost immediately, its reputation irreparably tarnished. She was forced to liquidate everything: the villa, the Nantucket house, her expensive car to satisfy the judgment. The life Robert had so carefully built for her, the life funded by my unwitting sacrifice, evaporated like mist. I never saw her again. She became a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered in certain circles. I felt no joy in her destruction, only a cold sense of justice served. The scales, so violently tipped against me, had been righted. But the void remained. The money, the properties, they were just things. They couldn't fill the silence in the house or heal the fracture in my soul. The victory party Michelle wanted to throw felt obscene. What was there to celebrate? The fact that I had to destroy my husband's legacy and bankrupt his mistress to reclaim what was rightfully mine? The fact that my son wasn't speaking to me? Daniel had gone silent after the verdict. The legal battle was over, and he had lost. I didn't know where he was or what he was thinking. I waited for a phone call, a letter, some sign that the reality of the court's ruling had pierced the fairy tale he'd chosen to believe. But the phone didn't ring. The only mail was from lawyers and financial institutions. I found myself wandering through the empty rooms, the judge's order in my hand. I had fought the war and won every battle, but I was standing alone in the conquered territory. The landscape was scarred and empty. I had my house back, my financial security restored, my name legally cleared, but I had no one to share it with. The victory had proven I was right, but it couldn't tell me who I was supposed to be now. One evening, I stood at the living room window, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and purple. The verdict had given me closure, but it had also carved out a new kind of emptiness. I had been defined for so long by the fight, by the betrayal, the gathering of evidence, the legal strategy. Now that it was over, who was I? Just a widow in a big, quiet house, a woman whose past had been a lie and whose future was a blank page. The void was terrifying. But as I stood there, the last of the sun's light fading, I realized something. For the first time in over 40 years, the page was truly blank. There were no expectations to meet, no facade to maintain, no one else's rhythm to follow. The verdict had given me back my money, but it had also given me something else, something I hadn't fought for but had earned nonetheless, a devastating, terrifying, and absolute freedom. The void wasn't just an emptiness, it was a space, and for the first time it was all mine to fill. The silence after the verdict was a living thing, but I learned to listen to its different tones. There was the hollow silence of Daniel's absence, a specific, painful note that would always be part of the composition. But there was also a clean, new silence, the quiet of a storm that has finally passed, leaving behind washed air and the potential for new growth. The void was no longer an abyss to be feared, but a field to be planted. I started small. I enrolled in a horticulture class at the local community college, something I had wanted to do for 30 years. My hands, which had spent decades balancing checkbooks and polishing silver, were now buried in rich, dark soil. I learned about pH levels and companion planting. I turned a neglected corner of the backyard into a vegetable patch. The first time a tomato I had nurtured from a seedling ripened in my palm, warm from the sun, I felt a simple, uncomplicated joy I hadn't known in decades. It was mine. I had grown it. The money from the judgment was placed in careful investments, managed by a financial advisor Michelle recommended. The security was a relief, a concrete floor beneath my feet, but it was not my focus. I sold the Nantucket house. The memories there were not mine to keep. I kept the family home, but I began to change it. Robert's study became a light-filled reading room. I donated his clothes to a charity that helped men re-entering the workforce. Each item released was a small stone of the old life cast away. Years passed in this way, a quiet, deliberate reconstruction. I traveled alone for the first time to Italy and spent a week in a small villa in Tuscany, eating food I didn't cook and answering to no one. I reconnected with a few old friends, like Ruth, with whom I shared lunches that were about the present and future, not the painful past. I was no longer Maggie, Robert's widow. I was just Maggie. And then, a crack of light appeared in the longest, darkest silence. My father passed away. He was 92 and had lived a full life, but the loss was a deep, resonant chord of grief. At the funeral, amidst the familiar sea of black, I saw him, Daniel. He stood at the back of the chapel, his face thinner, more mature, the boyish softness completely gone, replaced by a weary thoughtfulness. Our eyes met across the room. There were no smiles, no dramatic gestures. Just a long, silent look that held all the years and all the pain. After the service, as people milled about, he walked over to me. He didn't say anything at first. He just opened his arms. And I walked into them. We held each other, right there in the middle of everything, and we cried. They were not the tears of a happy reunion, but the deep, cleansing tears of shared grief and profound, complicated loss. We had both lost a father, and we had lost each other. "I'm sorry, Mom," he whispered into my hair, his voice thick. "I was so wrong. I was only defending an illusion the whole time." We began seeing each other again, cautiously, like explorers in a land that had been scarred by war. We met for coffee, for walks. It was stilted at first, the weight of our history a third person at the table. But slowly, we talked. I told him the whole story, not with the prosecutorial precision of the courtroom, but with the weary honesty of a mother. I showed him the evidence box, the photos he was in. I told him about selling my mother's ring. He listened, really listened this time. He had spent years building a shrine to his father's memory, and the lawsuit had felt like me desecrating it. But now, away from Linda's influence and with the dust settled, he could finally see the cracks in the idol. He saw the financial records not as an attack, but as proof of a fundamental deceit. He saw his own youthful presence in those photos, not as a happy memory, but as a manipulation. "He used me, too, didn't he?" he asked one afternoon, his voice quiet. "To make his other life seem more legitimate, more like a family." "I think he did." "Daniel," I said softly, "and I am so sorry you were caught in the middle of it. It took years." There was no single moment of full reconciliation, but a slow, patient mending, stitch by fragile stitch. He apologized, not just for the legal battle, but for the funeral, for the cafe, for every cruel word born of his own delusion. I forgave him, not because I had forgotten, but because I understood that he, too, had been a victim of Robert's elaborate fiction. One spring, I hosted a small garden party at the house. Daniel was there, with a new, kind-hearted girlfriend who knew our history and treated our fragile new bond with respect. Ruth was there, and a few other friends. The air was sweet with the scent of the crab apple tree I had planted 20 years ago. I stood to make a small toast. "I just want to say how grateful I am for all of you," I began, my voice clear and sure. I gestured to the crab apple tree, covered in a cloud of pale pink blossoms. "Last year, this thing almost died, a bad blight. I almost cut it down, I was so sure it was gone." I paused, looking around at the faces of my friends, my son. But this spring, it bloomed earlier than ever. And it's still blooming. The women chuckled softly, understanding in their eyes. I added, my gaze resting on Daniel. Even she knew that what is still alive should not be given up on. That night, when everyone had left, Daniel helped me fold up the chairs and put them away in the shed. The porch wind chime, a gift from Ruth, tinkled softly in the breeze. He hugged me goodbye, a real, warm hug. "I love you, Mom." "I love you too, Daniel." I always did. I turned to watch the sunset. It rested above the old maple tree at the end of the street, a final, brilliant splash of color, as if to say, Who are you really? I knew the answer now. I took off my heels, feeling the cool, solid wood of the porch floor beneath my bare feet. I walked into the house, hung up my dress, and went to bed. I was a survivor. I was a fighter. I was a gardener. I was a mother, reconciled. The truth had not been kind, but it had, ultimately, set me free. The long winter was over, and I was finally, unshakably, blooming. Up next, 2 more incredible stories are waiting for you right on your screen. If you enjoyed this one, you won't want to miss these. Just click to watch and don't forget to subscribe.